This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. This time around, I'm looking at board pump effects. These are effects that provide an until end of turn stats boost to all of your creatures. I think some people also call permanent pump effects, which are normally called anthems, board pumps, but because I've already done an entire separate video on them, I'm not including them here. Instead, I'll just be sticking to those temporary stats boosts. And they can be boosts of any kind to be eligible. Any boost to toughness or power at all was enough. In general, board pump effects are at their best in aggressive decks, since they result in a greater increase in damage the more creatures you have in play. In all, there were 213 cards eligible for this list, and in this video we'll talk about the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A top 8 at a Pro Tour, Players Tour, Mythic Championship, Mythic Invitational, or Legacy or Vintage Championship is worth 2 points, and a top 8 at a Magic Fest or Grand Prix is worth 1 point. At number 10, it is Atarka's command. Like other commands, it has 4 options and you get to choose 2 of them. One of Atarka's command's options is giving your whole board +1/+1 and reach. That's particularly potent when you combine it with the 3 damage to an opponent option, as you often end up spending 2 mana to do like 10 plus damage. It's a little awkward that it also gives reach, as that's only useful if you're blocking, and the decks that run this generally don't plan on doing much of that. But hey, it is basically just additional upside on a great card. Most of the time when this is cast, it is the board pump and 3 damage options that are chosen, but those other options are also some decent upside. Atarka's command was played in standard aggro decks, and it gained most of its points in Atarka Red, a deck that gets the Atarka in its name from Atarka's command. It's also been utilized in aggro decks in Modern, where many burn decks and red aggro decks used to splash green so that they could play the command. Atarka's command has fallen out of vogue in Modern though, and it doesn't have any points since 2017. That said, it seems powerful enough that it could find its way into more points in Modern, or maybe Pioneer. At number 9, it is Violent Outburst. It has the same score as Atarka's command, but it has more Pro Tour top 8s, so I gave it the edge. Some of you probably didn't want me to consider this card a board pump effect, because that part of the card is mostly secondary. Its power primarily comes from Cascade. However, I elected to include it because the decks that are interested in abusing the Cascade on Violent Outburst do actually cast it sometimes to help them do lethal, just like other board pump effects. Violent Outburst's main purpose has been to cascade into cards with no mana cost, like Living End and Hypergenesis. It's really easy to cascade into these, provided you construct a deck that has no other cards that Violent Outburst's Cascade can hit, and it can even be done at instant speed. These 2 spells are obviously super strong, so getting to play them so cheaply is awesome. Hypergenesis and Living Index found some success in Extended first, so much so that Hypergenesis got banned out of Extended and was preemptively banned in Modern. Living End was never banned though, and over the years it's gained some points in the format. Living Index play a bunch of cycling creatures, and once their graveyard is full enough, they play Violent Outburst or another Cascade card to play Living End, blowing up the opposing board and reanimating all of those creatures with cycling. Sometimes though, Living Index don't quite have the damage they need, and having another Violent Outburst around is a good way to do your last few damage. Violent Outburst actually enjoyed a recent burst in relevance as a result of Valky Cascade decks in Modern and Legacy, but because they changed the rules to keep you from being able to cascade into Tibalt, that deck never gained any points. Living Index are still a thing in Modern though, but they aren't exactly the kind of deck you expect to top 8 every major event, and it doesn't have any points since 2018. Violent Outburst's score will continue to go up, but probably not very quickly. At number 8, it's Kin Zealot, which has a board pump effect as an enter the battlefield ability, and it also grants haste, which is nice, especially because it includes the Zealot, so it can attack as a 3/3 right away. That ability can often lead to a ton of damage out of nowhere. However, the Zealot was a little too inefficient to really be amazing in either block or standard, where it was unable to gain any points. But Kin Zealot has been quite successful in Extended, Legacy, and even Vintage. In all of those formats, the plan isn't to cast Kin Zealot, it's to get it into the graveyard in dredge decks. Then you reanimate it at an opportune time, and by opportune, I mean a time when you can do lethal to your opponent. These decks often have Narcomoeba, Bridge from Below, and Sacrifice effects, so you can see how milling your whole library and getting back a Kin Zealot can win the game on the spot. Kin Zealot has a legacy top 8 from as recently as 2019, so we probably can't completely count it out just yet. However, it has been idle for a while, and it wouldn't be a total shock if its score doesn't change much going forward. At number 7, it is Cavalier of Flame. Like the Zealot, he provides a stats boost and haste to the whole board. Unlike the Zealot though, it does it with an activated ability, not an Enter the Battlefield ability. In addition to that, the Cavalier has a pretty nice body for 5 mana, has an Enter the Battlefield ability that lets you rummage, and when it dies, it does damage to your opponents and their planeswalkers equal to the number of lands in your graveyard. So yeah, it has a whole bunch of stuff in that text box. Cavalier of Flame gained all of its points in Standard, and they've all come in Fires of Invention decks. Those decks stopped using their mana once they got Fires into play, and so cards with nice mana sinks were pretty attractive, and that's what Cavalier of Flame has. You can pump all of your unused mana into it to make your board pretty scary. Ultimately, Fires got banned and Cavalier of Flame didn't gain any more points before it rotated out of Standard. At number 6, it is Castle Embereth, a land that comes with a board pump effect which can grant your creatures +1/+0. The whole cycle of Eldraine castles are pretty nice cards because they're pretty close to being basic lands with upside, especially in mono or 2-colored decks, as just having one mountain in play isn't that hard for decks like that, so Embereth will come into play untapped almost all the time, and then also have a meaningful activated ability. Red decks are often going wide and just need a few more damage to end games, and having a land that can help you get there is great. Like other lands with activated abilities, that means if you draw this land late, you don't feel completely terrible about it, since it can still do something other than produce mana. In Standard, Pioneer, and Historic, Castle Embereth has gained points in various red aggro decks. At number 5, it is Zealous Persecution. This board pump effect also simultaneously weakens your opponent's creatures, and that's some pretty great value for only 2 mana. I mean, it can outright kill X1s, and the combined effect of +1/+1 to your board and -1/-1 to your opponents is going to make your creatures really capable of winning combat most of the time, in addition to doing tons of damage if your opponent doesn't block. In Standard, it was mostly played in token decks, where it was kind of an interesting card since it was great for you if you were the token deck, but also really devastating against the token deck. It's been more successful in non-rotating formats, though. In Modern, it's gained points in tokens, junk, and Abzan. It finds its way into Modern sideboards because it's good against decks with lots of X1s, and it's an especially good way to deal with Slippery Bogle and its friends. Similarly, it's played a fair bit in Legacy because it kills a lot of problematic X1s, with True Name Nemesis being the most high-profile one it's capable of taking down. It doesn't have any points since 2018, so it'll be interesting to see how it does in the future. At number 4, it is Crater Hoof Behemoth. Of all the cards on this list, it's capable of giving the largest board pump effect, since it gives +1/+1 to your creatures for each creature you have in play, and a big stats boost is made even better when you combine it with Trample, since it means your opponent will have a hard time blocking effectively. The Behemoth also pumps itself and gives itself Trample, which is great, because it also has haste. Now, all of that does come at a rather steep price of 8 mana, so the decks that can run it either have to be capable of producing tons of mana or cheating it into play. The Behemoth is a great payoff for doing that stuff though, so it has found its way to 31 points over the years. In Standard, Crater Hoof Behemoth was played in Reanimator decks. In Modern, it gained its 1 point in Simic Ramp, and in Legacy, where it's gained the most points, it's been played in Elf decks. Elves and the Behemoth combine really well together because so many of them make mana, and by the time you have enough in play to help you cast the Behemoth, the stats boost he offers will be more than enough to make your board lethal. Crater Hoof Behemoth doesn't have any points since 2020, but that has more to do with a lack of legacy events as a result of the pandemic than it does with anything else. It's likely to gain more points going forward. At number 3, it is Garrok Wildspeaker. He was one of the first Planeswalkers ever, having been printed alongside 4 other monocolored Planeswalkers in Lorwyn. In typical green fashion, this Garrok can untap lands with a +1, create a 3/3 beast with a -1, and he has a -4 that gives you Overrun, +3/+3 and Trample to your whole board. Obviously, that last part is the part that qualifies him for this list. He was played in Standard in a wide variety of green decks, including aggressive decks like Elves, but also Ramp and various mid-range and control decks. In Extended, he was played in Deathcloud decks, which were particularly happy to play a walker like Garrok because it caused major destruction to the board, but Planeswalkers got to stick around. He also gained a few points in Modern Jund. Garrok doesn't have any points since 2014, and he is likely to slip down this list over time. At number 2, it's another garrok Relentless. This garrok is one of the more interesting designs we've ever seen on a planeswalker. On the garrok Relentless side, you have a planeswalker who can churn out wolf tokens. He can also do 3 damage to a creature, which is enough to kill a lot of things. Now, keep in mind the creature he damages also damages him, which is sort of a downside. But the upside there is if Garrok can lower his loyalty counters, like by using that ability, he flips into Garrok the Veil Cursed. Now, that does mean if a creature has more than 2 power, in most cases you're out of luck, but it is still crazy upside. Garrok the Veil Cursed is where the board pump part comes in. His -3 gives +X and trample to the whole board, with that bonus getting bigger the more creatures you have in your graveyard. This pairs pretty well with his +1, which spits out creature tokens, and his -1, which lets you sacrifice creatures to tutor up others. Garrok was heavily played in green decks in both block and standard, and he's even gained a few points in modern and legacy, but not any since 2017. And at number 1, it is Orjavpontiff. This is probably not an MTG top 10 where a lot of people will have guessed the number 1 card. When the Pontiff comes down, he gives you a choice between pumping your whole board or weakening your opponents. That's a pretty powerful into the battlefield trigger, even on a 3-mana 1/1, especially because the modality it offers means you will likely find a way to get something out of it no matter what. The Pontiff also comes with the haunt mechanic, which means that when it dies, you exile it and have it haunt one of your other creatures. Then, when that creature dies, you get that enter the battlefield trigger again. It was pretty good in Ravnica Block Constructed, where Saprolings dominated and it could wipe them all out. It did very little in Standard with only a single Pro Tour top 8, but it's done well in formats with larger card pools. In Extended, he gained a bunch of points in sideboards as he was a great counter to Elf decks, and Elf decks actually ran it too, since it was good in the mirror and pumping your whole board was pretty good too. In Modern, he gained the most points primarily in Birthing Pod decks. He's a good utility creature to run a singleton copy of, since you could get it if you needed to kill opposing small creatures, or if you needed to pump your whole board to swing for lethal. Then, when you sacrificed it to your pod, you could have it haunt something else, which is probably what you're going to sacrifice next, and get that trigger again. The pod was, of course, eventually banned, but Orjavpontiff continues to see play in toolbox decks in Modern. The Pontiff has also found its way into some legacy sideboards, in decks like Eldrazi Aggro and Death and Taxes. Like Zealous Persecution, the Pontiff gets a pretty big boost from being able to kill true name Nemesis. The Pontiff has seen more play recently than either of the Garroks that are at number 2 and number 3, and I think that means it's likely to hold on to its number 1 spot on this list for a while. Alright, those are the 10 cards with board pump effects that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you're interested in pumping your whole board, you can buy these cards at Card Kingdom. You can find individual links for each of them in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, as that will help more people see the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you need to catch up on past videos, you should see a playlist on your screen now. And if you're interested in hearing me talk about more than just Magic, I actually have another YouTube channel where I talk about history called Nitzahone History, and you should see a link to go to that channel on your screen now. Thanks for watching.